What if 1 out of every 3 people you knew suddenly died? It may sound like a nightmarish question, but it actually happened in the 14th century. Welcome. In today's story, we re-traveling back to the Middle Ages to explore the deadliest pandemic in recorded history, the Black Death. This was the plague outbreak that obliterated entire communities and reshaped civilization in its wake. Over just a few years, it killed tens of millions of people, more than 50 million in Europe alone. Today, we'll uncover what the Black Death really was, how it spread so disastrously, and how that dark episode ultimately gave rise to the public health measures we rely on now. Get ready for a journey through one of history's darkest chapters and the critical lessons it left behind. When we talk about the Black Death, what exactly do we mean? Simply put, it was an explosive outbreak of bubonic plague, a highly infectious fever caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. This germ lurked in rodents and the fleas that fed on them. In the normal cycle, a flea bites an infected rat and picks up the bacteria, then hops to bite a human, transmitting the plague with a single painful nip. Once in a person's bloodstream, Y. pestis wreaks havoc. Typically, it causes bubonic plague, named for the buboes, painful, swollen lymph nodes that erupt under the arms, in the groin, or on the neck. Victims also spike high fevers, vomit, and become delirious as infection spreads. If the bacteria invade the lungs, the illness can turn into pneumonic plague, which is even more deadly and contagious, spread by coughing. In the 1300s, of course, nobody knew about bacteria or plague bacilli, yet people watched in horror as this mysterious sickness passed from one person to the next with frightening speed, causing agonizing illness. Without treatment, bubonic plague kills about 30–60% of those infected, and the pneumonic form is almost invariably fatal. In the medieval world, that meant once plague struck a town, death was nearly certain for countless people. A terror beyond anything they had ever imagined. Why does the Black Death still matter today? For one, its sheer destruction was unparalleled. Historians estimate that between 1347 and 1351, about 25 million people died in Europe from this plague, roughly 1/3 of Europe's population at the time. Some scholars put the toll even higher when accounting for deaths in Asia and North Africa, since the pandemic stretched across continents. In certain regions, up to 60% of the population perished. To put that in perspective, the Black Death took a greater proportional toll of life than any other epidemic or war up to that point in history. Entire villages were wiped off the map. Imagine the impact on daily life. Farms and workshops left without workers, streets filled with funerals, and families broken apart overnight. Normal life ground to a halt. Chroniclers of the time describe grass growing in once bustling city squares because so few people were left. Trade and commerce came to a standstill, and even ongoing wars were abandoned as societies struggled just to survive. The psychological impact was enormous. Survivors were traumatized by grief and fear, often convinced that the world itself was ending. Beyond the immediate suffering, the Black Death permanently changed the course of history for those who lived through it. With so many dead, the social order of medieval Europe began to crack. Labor became scarce, so peasants and workers who survived found they could demand better wages and conditions, a radical shift in the feudal economy. Some historians even link the Black Death to the eventual decline of serfdom, because landowners, desperate for workers, had to make concessions to the lower classes. At the same time, the plague scarred the culture. Art and literature became fixated on death. The haunting images of skeletons in the Danse Macabre paintings, for instance, symbolize how people were processing the ubiquity of mortality. Trust in authorities and traditional wisdom was shaken. Many turned to extreme piety or hedonism, believing each day could be their last. And in a tragic twist, fear sought scapegoats. Rumors spread that certain minority groups had caused the plague, and anti-Semitic violence erupted, with Jews falsely accused of poisoning wells, leading to horrendous massacres amidst the chaos. So, the Black Death's significance lies not only in the lives it took, but in how it transformed the survivors' world, economically, socially, and spiritually. Now let's dig into how this nightmare began and unfolded. The origins of the Black Death were long mysterious, but recent scientific sleuthing has given us a clearer picture. The story likely starts in the remote steppes of Central Asia. In fact, DNA evidence from ancient graves in modern-day Kyrgyzstan points to a massive plague outbreak there in the late 1330s. At a trade outpost near Lake Issyk-Kul, tombstones from 1338-1339 record an unknown pestilence that researchers have now identified as plague. From this initial spark in Central Asia, the contagion began moving westward along the Silk Road trade routes. Caravans carried goods and stowaway rats with infected fleas across Asia. By 1346, the disease had reached the edges of Europe. A famous incident occurred at the Crimean port city of Kaffa, now Feodosia, Ukraine. As an epidemic raged through the attacking Mongol army outside the city walls, the besiegers reportedly catapulted plague-infected corpses over the walls in a grim early form of biological warfare. Whether or not that account is apocryphal, we know that by 1347, the plague jumped from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Genoese trading ships, likely infested with rats and fleas, sailed from Kaffa and arrived in places like Sicily and Marseille, bearing the deadly cargo. From there, it was like a spark hitting dry grass. The contagion raced through Europe. In 1348, it roared through Italy, France, and the Iberian Peninsula. By late that year, it reached as far as England. Southern England was infected by 1348, and the pestilence swept into the north and even Scandinavia by 1350. No corner of Europe was spared for long, and it didn't stop there. The pandemic also devastated large parts of the Middle East and North Africa as it spread along trade networks and pilgrimage routes. This was truly a global crisis of the medieval world. The mechanism behind this rapid spread was the convergence of biology and ecology with human society. The bubonic plague bacterium traveled in the blood of oriental rat fleas that lived on black rats, a species that thrived in human settlements. Medieval towns were notoriously filthy by modern standards. Streets and ships teemed with rodents. People had no idea that a tiny flea bite was the true killer. They noticed only that suddenly neighbors became feverish, grew black-blue swellings, and died horribly within days. We now understand that after a flea bites an infected rodent, the plague bacteria multiply in the flea's gut, blocking it. Driven by hunger, since its gut is blocked, the flea jumps to a new host and regurgitates infected blood into the bite wound, infecting the victim. Once humans were infected, Y. pestis could sometimes spread person to person through respiratory droplets, if it caused pneumonic plague in the lungs. It was the perfect storm, a highly lethal pathogen riding on ubiquitous rats and fleas, spreading silently in merchant caravans and ships, then bursting into human populations that had zero immunity. Victims of the Black Death experienced some of the most frightening symptoms imaginable. A contemporary Italian writer, Boccaccio, described how people would go to bed healthy and be dead by morning. Typically, it started with a high fever and chills, intense aches, and exhaustion. Then the telltale swellings appeared, those buboes, often golf ball to apple-sized lumps in the groin or armpits, tender and burning hot. Some victims bled internally, causing visible black bruising, one reason it would later be called the Black Death. In the final stages, many endured delirium or coma before death. The speed was also terrifying. In many cases, someone might collapse and die within just 2 to 3 days of the first symptoms. With no antibiotics, which wouldn't exist until the 20th century, medieval medicine had no cure to offer. The standard treatments of the era, bloodletting, herbal balms, or prayer, were utterly ineffective against plague. In fact, being treated by a doctor was no guarantee of safety. Plague killed doctors and priests just as readily as peasants. The inexorable fatality rate made it feel like a divine punishment or an evil curse to those who lived through it. Crucially, public health as we know it barely existed in the 14th century. People did not understand microbes. They didn't know that infected fleas on rats were spreading the illness. Many explanations circulated. Perhaps it was bad air, miasma from rotting waste, or an unlucky alignment of the planets. Some saw it as God's wrath for humanity's sins. In this desperate confusion, folks tried all manner of preventative charms, posies of fragrant herbs to ward off bad air, amulets, or religious penance like self-flagellation, hoping to appease divine anger. None of it stopped the disease. However, amid the panic, some early public health measures did emerge by trial and error. Authorities in certain cities observed patterns and took action. In northern Italy, city officials in places like Venice and Milan started to implement emergency rules in 1348 as the plague hit. They didn't know about bacteria, but they grasped that limiting contact could slow the spread. They isolated the sick, banned large gatherings, and burned or disinfected the belongings of plague victims. One historian noted that medieval people understood enough about the Black Death to implement some of the world's first anti-contagion measures, like keeping a distance and cleaning surfaces. In port cities, officials also realized that plague could ride in on ships and goods, so they tried to control imports and even fumigate merchandise. As an expert explains, they knew that you had to be very careful with goods being traded because the disease could be spread on objects, and that you tried your best to limit person-to-person contact. These actions were hit or miss, but they hint at a growing, if imperfect, understanding that plague was contagious. Places that reacted quickly sometimes fared better. For example, legend has it that Milan's authorities walled up infected houses, which may have spared much of the city. Still, in the face of such a virulent disease, these measures could only do so much with the knowledge and tools available at the time. By 1351, the first wave of the Black Death finally burned itself out, having killed millions. Yet the plague did not disappear. It lurked and flared up again in recurrent outbreaks for centuries. Medieval society was forced to adjust to a grim new reality. Plague could return at any time. And indeed it did, every decade or so, somewhere or other, all the way until the 17th century. At this point, you might be wondering, how does the Black Death compare to the pandemics we face in the modern world? It's a fascinating and humbling question. Let's start with scale. The COVID-19 pandemic that began in 2020 has been the most severe global health crisis of recent times, causing tremendous disruption. Yet in terms of mortality, COVID-19 is, thankfully, nowhere near the Black Death's league. As of 2025, around 7 million confirmed deaths have been reported worldwide from COVID-19, a tragic number, but out of a global population of 8 billion, it's a small fraction. The Black Death, by contrast, may have killed 200 million people when the world's population was only around 400 million. In parts of Europe, between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population died during the Black Death. We simply are not used to that level of devastation today. Even the infamous 1918 influenza pandemic, the Spanish flu, often cited as the deadliest modern pandemic, caused an estimated 25–50 million deaths worldwide, comparable to the Black Death in absolute numbers, yet by 1918, the world's population was far larger and more spread out. So in terms of proportion of lives lost and societal impact, the Black Death stands in a category of its own. Another key difference is speed and connectivity. Modern pandemics like COVID-19 spread with lightning speed due to international air travel. The virus leapt between continents in a matter of weeks. The Black Death moved much slower, taking months or years to crawl across Eurasia. In the 14th century, news traveled slowly, and infected ships took weeks to sail from port to port. However, once a pandemic is underway, our 21st century advantage is science and coordination. When COVID struck, researchers identified the new coronavirus within days and sequenced its genome within weeks. Global networks, like the World Health Organization, shared data and coordinated responses. In stark contrast, medieval people were groping in the dark. They had no laboratories, no concept of microscopic pathogens, and of course no vaccines or antibiotics. This meant that their responses, though sometimes surprisingly savvy, like isolating the sick, were based on observation and fear rather than scientific understanding. What about the responses by authorities and communities? Here we actually see some parallels, as well as big differences. During the Black Death, some city governments imposed what we'd recognize now as lockdowns or cordons sanitaires, for example, closing city gates to outsiders when plague was nearby, or requiring travelers to undergo isolation. People in 2020 learned the term social distancing, but medieval Italians were already practicing a version of it in 1348. That said, modern public health has a far deeper toolbox. From mass vaccination campaigns to advanced medical care like ventilators, none of which existed in medieval times. Also, today there's a notion of global solidarity, however imperfect. Scientists exchanging findings, countries sending aid or expertise. In the 14th century, each town was largely on its own. If one city figured out a useful measure, there was no internet or rapid communication to spread that knowledge widely. Indeed, it took decades and repeated outbreaks for certain best practices to become common. Another difference is record-keeping and honesty. We track cases and deaths meticulously now, again, not perfectly, but we try, whereas medieval records were sparse and sometimes deliberately underreported. In the 1300s, admitting your city had plague could scare away trade or invite stigma, so some local leaders hid outbreaks, which only allowed the disease to spread more. In summary, modern pandemics tend to spread faster but kill a far smaller proportion of the population, thanks in large part to better knowledge and tools. Yet the emotional experience, the fear, the uncertainty, the disruption of daily life that we felt in COVID-19 would have been exponentially worse in the 14th century, when death was all around and nobody knew why. The Black Death can thus be seen as a tragic baseline, a worst-case scenario of what an unmitigated pandemic can do to society. Now, let us look at the long-term lessons and changes that emerged from the Black Death. Because remarkably, this terrible scourge prompted innovations that paved the way for modern public health. Perhaps the most famous development was the invention of quarantine. The word quarantine comes from the Italian quarantino, meaning 40 days. Why 40 days? It turns out that in the aftermath of the Black Death, port cities in the Mediterranean began experimenting with isolating people who might carry the plague. The first known official quarantine law was passed in 1377 in the Adriatic port of Ragusa, present-day Dubrovnik, Croatia. The law said that newcomers from plague-affected areas had to spend a month on a remote island before entering the city. Initially, it was 30 days, but officials later extended it to 40 days, likely because 40 had cultural and medical resonance, 40 days of Lent in Christian tradition, and a notion from Hippocrates that disease's danger period might be around 40 days. And thus, quarantine was born. This concept of isolating potentially exposed individuals was a game changer. Venice, a major trade hub, soon adopted similar measures, setting up dedicated quarantine stations, called lazarettos, on islands where sailors and cargo would wait out the requisite period before they were allowed ashore. Over time, other port cities and countries adopted quarantine practices whenever plague or other epidemics threatened. It is a practice that has obviously survived into the present. We were still using quarantine and isolation in the COVID-19 pandemic, following the same basic principle established in the 14th century: separate the possibly infected to prevent the disease from spreading. Public sanitation and hygiene also received a big push forward thanks to the Black Death's harsh lessons. In medieval cities, sanitation was rudimentary at best. Garbage, excrement, and stagnant water provided a paradise for rats and disease. After the shock of the plague, some cities started taking cleanliness more seriously. They cleared trash from streets, improved burial practices to ensure corpses didn't contaminate water sources, and eventually even implemented rudimentary street cleaning and trash removal services. It wasn't immediate, but the sustained threat of plague outbreaks forced authorities to reckon with the environment's role in health. For example, authorities in Italian city-states gradually developed boards of health that took measures like inspecting food markets, regulating the disposal of waste, and ensuring clean water where possible. These efforts were still based on the miasma idea, eliminating bad air smells, but they had real beneficial effects: fewer rats, fewer fleas, fewer chances for plague to find a home. Another innovation was the establishment of pest houses and early hospitals specifically for contagious diseases. Before the Black Death, hospitals in Europe were mostly charity institutions run by religious orders, often caring for the poor and pilgrims, or leper colonies for those suffering leprosy. The plague changed that. Cities like Venice and Milan, facing repeated epidemics, repurposed existing leper hospitals into plague hospitals on the city outskirts. They understood that isolating the sick in designated places could help protect the healthy. Over time, these temporary measures evolved into more permanent plague wards or isolation hospitals whenever an outbreak occurred. This experience of needing organized healthcare responses to epidemics was a stepping stone towards the more formal hospital systems and public health institutions that would develop in later centuries. Crucially, the repeated waves of plague spurred the creation of a public health bureaucracy, an early form of what we now call health departments. By the 15th century, a generation or two after the Black Death's first strike, many Italian and European cities had established permanent health boards or magistracies to deal with plague. For instance, Venice set up the Provveditori alla Sanità health office, and Milan, Florence, and others followed with their own health commissions. These boards had authority to do things like impose quarantine, control movement in and out of the city, and organize burials. They also kept records of deaths and illnesses, which was one of the first attempts at systematic disease surveillance. In a way, these were the ancestors of our modern public health agencies like the CDC or the WHO, albeit on a local scale. They recognized that health was a collective concern, a radical idea that government should take action to protect people from disease, not just leave it to fate or individual effort. As one historian noted, the concept of health as a common and collective good really took hold because of the plague's impact. Rulers and citizens alike saw the value in investing in measures to prevent catastrophe, building plague hospitals, stocking medicinal supplies, even developing early vaccination-like practices in later centuries. All this grew from the hard lessons of the Black Death era. Over time, these efforts contributed directly to the rise of modern public health systems. The Black Death, horrible as it was, taught humans that we can take collective action against epidemics, and that we must. Let's summarize the key takeaways from this journey through the Black Death. First, we saw that an event from nearly 700 years ago remains the deadliest pandemic in history, with a death toll so high that it's almost impossible to fathom. The Black Death wasn't just a medieval curiosity. It reshaped demographics, economies, and even the mindset of entire continents. Second, we identified the cause: a bacterium, Y. pestis, spread by fleas on rats. This seems straightforward now, but at the time it was an invisible killer, and recognizing how it spread took centuries. Third, the pandemic's devastation changed daily life and society. It disrupted everything from war to work, and the trauma left cultural and social changes, some for better like improved wages for workers, and some for worse like intensified scapegoating of minorities. Fourth, the way the Black Death spread, slowly by today's standards, but inexorably, shows us how connected the old world was through trade, and it underscores the importance of quick action. We noted that it took years to traverse continents, whereas modern diseases can do so in hours. Yet the medieval world was defenseless without science. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, we learned that the Black Death sparked crucial advances in public health. The invention of quarantine, early practices of social distancing and disinfection, greater attention to sanitation, and the formation of public health authorities. These measures are the ancestors of what keep us safe today. The Black Death forced humanity to recognize that fighting disease required community-wide effort and innovative thinking. It is sobering to realize that many of the tools we used against COVID-19, isolating the exposed, tracking the spread, mobilizing government resources, have their roots in lessons learned from that medieval plague. In short, the Black Death was a catastrophe that reshaped civilization, as our title suggests. It taught us in the hardest way possible about the power of infectious diseases, and it set in motion changes that would eventually lead to a healthier, more prepared society in the centuries that followed. Thank you so much for watching and coming along on this journey through one of history's most harrowing times. We hope this story was as enlightening as it was chilling. It's amazing how an event from the 14th century still echoes in our world today. If you enjoyed this deep dive and learned something new, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel. We have many more fascinating stories at the intersection of history and public health on the way. Up next, we'll fast forward to the present and explore how modern scientists track outbreaks. Basically, how do we detect and monitor epidemics in real time today, using all the tech and knowledge that's evolved since the days of the Black Death? You won't want to miss that episode, especially after seeing what our predecessors endured without these tools. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and take care of each other.